This afternoon, I'm really delighted to welcome a young lady from Cornwall who calls herself Just Kelly. You're not just Kelly, are you? You're Kelly,
No.
you're Kelly Harris, mother of
Yes.
4, and you've experienced in your short life. I can see you're young. I don't know how old you are, Kelly, but I can see that you've. I've got a
Just
few.
turned 39.
Just turned. Oh gosh, big one coming up shortly. Then, crikey, you don't look 39. Good grief. So, mother of 4, and you've been through a thing or two, haven't you, in your short life?
Yes, you could say that. Yes, definitely.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about today primarily is about grief.
Yes.
And how you have coped with it, how it's affected your life, what it was that affected your life, and how you've coped with it, and how writing, I think, has had a big part in that as well. So tell us wherever you want to begin from, Kelly, about your grief stories. It's not just one.
Well, it is. It's 2 stories, isn't it? Really. I mean, that's the thing. It's like I lost twins. That was my first pregnancy, and I was 25 weeks pregnant and went into spontaneous labour, and they died shortly afterwards. And they lived for a short time on Earth, but they were just too premature. So I lost them, and I was only 25 at the time. But I kind of went on, and I dealt with it by getting pregnant again very, very quickly, because that was kind of my way of dealing with it then. So I continued with my family and things like that. And of course, it was incredibly sad. But me and my husband, when the twins died, we were kind of on the same page. So we were dealing with everything together. Do you know what I mean? As we was grieving, we wanted the same things. Everything was very synchronized, and we both wanted children. So that was kind of where our focus was. And I suppose now in hindsight, that was a bit like just putting a big plaster over the grief that we just had. And it wasn't like we were ignoring it. We were just compartmentalizing it, putting it in Pandora's box, so to speak. Anyway, we went on and had family, and you don't ever think that that's going to happen to you anyway, to lose children. But then to go on and that happened to you again. In 2012, we was about to kind of complete our family, so to speak. And I went to 38 weeks and suffered a stillbirth. And that essentially is where my grieving began, because that ripped off the plaster from obviously from the twins dying, and it just had a massive compounding effect on everything. I felt like I was grieving for 3 children all at the same time, and that was because the grief from before was never really dealt with. And me and my husband were not on the same page this time round, and it was incredibly difficult. He wanted to help me massively, and he wanted to be there for me, and I didn't want him to be there for me. I was very disconnected to my emotions, very disconnected to my feelings. I went into some incredibly dark places, and that, I suppose, was where my grief, my journey of grief really began. And that was when I started trying to find help. Well, I didn't actually even think that I needed help for quite a long time, because I was in denial. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, it was incredibly difficult.
So dare I ask, are you and your husband still together?
We are. I suppose it's a kind of happy ever after, really. I suppose we did separate, and it was, like I said, it was incredibly difficult. It put a lot of pressure on our marriage and our relationship, because we were dealing with things so differently. And we did have to part. And it was a bit like going backwards to go forwards again. It was a bit like having to have time to heal yourself before there was any room for anybody else. Even my children, to a degree. Do you know what I mean? I do still feel incredibly guilty about how I disconnected myself from them as well at the time. But it was so difficult to do. I didn't know where to go, and I didn't know how to heal. And I didn't know what I needed. And I felt so responsible for everybody else's emotions related to the deaths of my children. You know, I felt bad that my mum was sad about it. I felt bad that my husband, every time I looked at my husband, all I could see was pain. You know, my children were hurting, everybody was hurting, and I felt responsible for that. Do you know what I mean? And that was, you know, it's not, you know, it's not a self-pity thing. It was just a, you know, I just felt like it was my fault. It was my fault that everybody was feeling this way, and obviously it wasn't. But at the time, that's why I believe that grief does have such an effect on your mental health when it's not dealt with, and when you're not guided through the process and enabled to speak to. And it's not that help isn't out there, it's just the ability to find it, or being shown the doors to open. You know, you don't know where it is, because most of the help that's available is charity funded, and you know, it's not readily available. You know, there's waiting lists, and you just don't know where to go. And it's such a painful experience, you don't really know where to start. Equally as well, I find that grief is one of those things that there's no time on it. So when it did happen, I almost carried on with life regardless. And then it wasn't until it was almost like a delayed onset of grief.
It's interesting that you say about you feeling responsible for everybody else, and it's not just in the situation that you're in. I've heard exactly the same comment this week. A friend of mine is in a hospice, and sadly she is coming to the end of her life with cancer, and she said that she feels responsible. Everybody that comes into her room to see her, she feels responsible for their reaction to what's happening to her. She's okay about it. She's having what we call a good death, so it's an unusual situation, but she's feeling responsible for everybody else. And I think that just shows that you're human.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
as you say, where do you go for help? Who do you go? So how did you deal with it? I mean, how have you dealt with it? How are you dealing with things?
Well, it took me a long time. It did take me a long time. It took a lot, you know, every bit of the time. I think when you reach that dark place, ideally, obviously, the ideal process would be to be guided from the moment that you've lost somebody, down a path where you feel like you're not being judged, and that there's an open, there's avenues to go to when you're feeling like you just need reassurance that actually it's okay to feel like that. Yeah. And I think that the process, there isn't, it's broken. So everything that when you need to find help, it's all on, you need to obviously accept that you need it to be able to then look for it. So you just have to use the channels that everybody else does, I suppose, which is what I did, which was use the internet and Google places for help and things like that. But I don't think that's an ideal situation. I think there should be more of a smoother transition from especially, when you lose a child. But again, I suppose grief does change depending on the circumstances. Do you mean, is it like losing somebody to a fatal accident or very quickly, compared to losing somebody who has suffered with or battled with a long-term illness? The grief, the process is a very different situation.
I don't think they are, Kelly. I think grief is grief. I don't care what you call it, how you dress it up. Whether it's, like you say, long-term illness, losing a person, even losing a job. Being made redundant, that is grief. In the simplest sense, grief is grief, and we're all different, and how we react to it is different.
Yeah. That's it. We are all different.
And as you say, it's accepting it. But I think acknowledgement, I've got this thing called the 4 A's. So acknowledge. So whatever the situation is that you're in, acknowledge what's happened. Don't brush it under the carpet. But again, even acknowledging something, lots of people go around their head in the sand in denial. But once you get to the stage of acknowledging what's happened to you, you then need to go to the acceptance, and then aligning with whatever action you need to take. So kind of 4 A's.
Yeah.
It's easy for me just to say that, oh yes, the 4 A's, acknowledge, accept, align, and act. Should we break for your little girl?
Could you say she's come in? So sorry.
That's quite all right.
There's your drink. Good girl. just come for a drink.
Bless. Okay. So yeah, it's you know it's easy to say acknowledge, accept, align, and act, but the actual process of doing that can be, you know, weeks. Some people go straight to act, but a lot of people it's years. And with your case of losing Elliot, that's 6 years already now.
Yeah, it's 2012. Yeah.
So coming on 7 years this year.
Yeah.
We lost my granddaughter. She was 17 months old, and she had the MMR jab and died 10 days later. So that's coming up now 9 years, but it still hurts. You know, it's that's still, you know,
that's the thing. There is no time for grief, and I think, you know, when you're saying about the A's, I've wrote a lot about acceptance and this, you know, the stages of grief. I think I called it 50 Shades of Grief.
Yes.
On my blog, and you know, anger was one thing.
Yeah.
I was angry at everybody, the world, myself. So that's another A.
Understandably, yeah, absolutely. Angry, yeah. I shall add that to my list of A's. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But so what was it that kind of was the trigger then for you? When did you start to get help? How long was it, and where did you go?
It was some time before it was about 6 months, possibly even longer than that, really. It was definitely towards the end of the first year after losing Elliot that things really spiraled out of control, and everyone around you who cares for you and knows you well enough tells you that you need help, and you know, you could do with talking to somebody, or you're not yourself, but until you accept that that's what you need, it's like talking to a brick wall. But yeah, I think sometimes that acceptance needs to take you to a dark place for you to then realize it's almost like a switch being switched on, and you're like, oh, it's like, I need to do something now before it's too late.
The only way is up.
And your only way is up. So yeah, and I had quite a lot of therapy. So I had some grief counselling that I waited for. Also had some CBT counselling and some talk therapy. And they all worked very differently, but eventually it was writing that I found that really helped, because I found it very difficult to open up and talk without bursting into tears whenever I talked about it. You know, it's so personal to me that talking about it hurt quite a lot, and that was what I found very difficult. But I found writing was a way of me getting it down on paper, and then my counsellors would read what I'd wrote, and it gave us a topic to talk about.
Yes, yeah, you didn't have
guidance.
You didn't have to regurgitate it all over again, and each time you do that, you're opening the wounds again, aren't you?
Yeah. So writing became a really good way of me advocating how I felt, and you know, my counsellors were able to, you know, take parts from that, and you know, it was, you know, talking is the biggest healer of all, I think. You know, just talking about anything to do with it, you know, just being an open book and chatting to anyone is a really great way of just getting those emotions off of your chest and just getting them out there into the world, you know what I mean, rather than keeping it in, you know. And that's the worst thing ever, I think. Is
absolutely. And that's why a lot of people that I mentor through cancer, they struggle with, because you can put as many lotions and potions and therapies and all sorts with whatever condition you're dealing with, but if you don't deal with the emotional root, which is a cause of nearly every illness going, then you're not going to heal. So emotional expression, to me, is one of the biggest things that you can do to help yourself, whether it's writing, talking, you know, painting, you know, however you express yourself. I think that's really important. So yeah, that's excellent. So what about your husband in all this, Kelly? Did he receive any help?
He did have some counselling. He had some counselling quite early on, and it's really funny, although we do speak about it, and we did at the time, it's almost like we've come to a point where we don't really talk about our journey to each other. Do you know what I mean? And that's not a bad thing. I think obviously it's still quite painful at times to even discuss it with each other. I think when it's birthdays and Christmas, we talk about things. We talk about, you know, what would it be like now? You know, that sort of a conversation. But you know, our grief journey is still quite personal to each of us. I'm not sure whether that's because we hurt each other. You know, that old saying, hurt people," is so true. You know, I was hurting, he was hurting, and we were, you know, essentially hurting each other. So, you know, we haven't really talked about our grief journey together, so to speak, but you know, we are fine. We've come back together. If anything, we're stronger than ever now. So, you know, it's kind of a happy ever after in that respect. So yeah, he's good.
That's good. Happy ever after, but not happy ever ending, because it never ends, does it? It will go on.
It never ends. No.
My daughter and son-in-law, they go away every year on the anniversary. In fact, last week on the 16th of January was the anniversary of Lucy May's death, and they go away every year on the nearest weekend. So I'm booked to babysit every 16th of January weekend and look after my other grandchildren. And they go away, they spend time on their own, and they take that time to remember Lucy May, and that's their special time together.
I think that's a really important thing to do, because we, on the 6th of December every year, is when our Christmas starts. Because Elliot was born on the 6th of December, we put our Christmas decorations up on that day, and we put the tree up, and that's our way of, you know, remembering Elliot, but also starting our Christmas. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Because of the time of year it was incredibly difficult to separate the two, you know, especially when you've got other children. You know, it's very hard when you've got other children. They, you know, especially young children, their understanding levels are, you know, how do you start to explain to children about stillbirth and death of children when, you know, when you struggle yourself to even comprehend it? It's a very difficult thing. So the 6th of December every year, and we do try to go away. Last year, actually, we went to pantomime and things like that over the weekend of, which would have been his birthday, and it was a really nice thing to do. It was a nice little token to him and a start of our Christmas. So I think it's good to do things like that.
Yes, I do too. Do your friends talk to you about Elliot?
Yeah, they do. It's never really instigated by anybody else. Do you know what I mean? That's that again. I think it's the fear of upsetting somebody. You know, yeah. So talking about Elliot to me is never really instigated by anybody other than myself. But I'm quite happy to talk about him, and you know, and when people know that I'm comfortable with it, they will then ask questions. So yeah, well, you know, it's. I've got pictures of my children around the home, so you know, they're there for discussion, for memories and things like that. So
yes, brilliant. And I'm sure as your children get older, how old are they now, Kelly?
My eldest has just turned 12, so Liliella's 12, Toby is 10, Isla is 7, and the little one is 3.
So you've really got your hands full, haven't you?
Yeah, it's good to be busy.
And your oldest two, they would have been aware of what happened at the time, not necessarily understanding. So in terms of counselling, have they had any counselling?
Yeah, definitely. My son, not so much, because I'm not sure whether he's accepted it better or but my daughter massively struggled for a long time, and she had to have quite a lot of counselling, because how it affected her was separation anxiety. You know, she really struggled doing play dates, sleepovers, being away from her family home, you know, anywhere. You know, if she wasn't at home with us, you know, the separation really drove her essentially it was driving her mad. You know, she couldn't sleep at night. It was affecting her sleep. She kept thinking we was all going to die and burn in our sleeps. It was really quite bad at one point, and you know, that was a you know, a side effect of losing her brother, and without understanding. You know, I think all of a sudden a child is faced with losing somebody, and they're not mentally old enough to understand their own mortality. You know, they start then questioning their own mortality and people around them, and they start questioning. You know, it's not something that a child, well, should really be have to go through at such a young age, is it? It's life, but it's a sad factor that they're not emotionally equipped at that age to take on what's happened. So
No, absolutely. So
they,
I presume the school were understanding and supportive, were they?
not so much really. It was everything was really instigated by myself. Again, I think it's just a lack of understanding of how grief affects people. I just think that it's, you know, it's just shied off, you know, because Lily Ella's anxiety was a very slow process. You know, it wasn't something that happened, you know, Elliot died the next month she was anxious. You know, this was a progressive thing. So I suppose in the eyes of the onlookers, some people think, well, should be over that by now. It's that old, you know, and that was hard. But once they were on board, they were very supportive. But it was, you know, getting them to try and understand where she was at.
You've mentioned to me that you're writing a book.
Mm-hmm.
How is that? What's the theme? How are you going to sort of pitching it?
I'm pitching it as, I'm calling it a mother's, the journey of grief through a mother's eyes. Just because I feel that I'm trying to write a book that I wish I could have read when I was feeling the way I was feeling. I wish that I could have just read something that was real, that, you know, that maybe stung a bit, hurt a bit, but made me realise that I wasn't that person that's going mad, rocking in the corner, crying. You know, to make me understand that actually it's a process and it's okay to feel like this. And you know, because there were some times that I thought I was literally cracking up, and I just would like to be able to write a book that could help somebody else in that way.
I think that's a really good way of dealing with it for yourself and your family, but also, as you say, that there's not a lot out there. When my granddaughter died, we were given a book called Angels in My Hair by Lorna Byrne. I don't know if you've come across that book.
No, but I think there's a similar book that I was told to read by one of the counsellors, and it was a nice book, but it wasn't kind of what I needed.
Yeah, and at the time you need different things. I think I read the book about a year later in our family situation, and I found it very, very comforting. So it's, you know, different things, different people.
Again, it's about different times as well, isn't it? You know, a book that I read then, maybe if I reread it now, I'd look at it in a different light. So I think it's reading things at different times. You process things differently. You're at a different timeline of your grief. You'll be more receptive to different writing. So
yes, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so thank you very much for sharing your story, Kelly. It's not an easy topic to talk about, and I know it's, you know, some years since you lost Elliot, but it's still, you know, fresh as a daisy in your mind, I'm sure, and will always be. So,
yeah.
Thank you. And I asked people to choose 2 songs on the show, and you've chosen Fix You by Coldplay and Small Bump by Ed Sheeran.
Yes, I have.
Why did you choose both of those songs?
Well, simply because of the topic we're talking about. Obviously, the death of my twins back in 2005 when they were born. just wanted to fix them. They were born alive. They lived for a small amount of time. And I always remember listening to the song when I was pregnant with them and always really liking it. And it would always come on. And I'd walk into Asda and it would come on. I'd be in the car and it would come on. And I'd be like, oh, this is my song, not knowing what was laid ahead of me. But it was just almost like the song was wrote for me. And I know that sounds really cheesy, but it was, as soon as the twins passed away, I just knew that that was the song that I would have played at their funeral. So that was played there, and Small Bump was just one that I related to. It's not necessarily, obviously, I went almost full term with Elliot, so it wasn't really a small bump at all. It was quite a large bump. It was just a song that I related to emotionally. So yeah, both of those songs are in memory of my 3 children, Elliot, Louis and Corey.
Oh, bless. Thank you very much, Kelly. Here are your songs coming up.
Thank you very much.